So let's jump right in with a pretty radical idea. What if the Bible, one of the most important books in human history, is actually missing some parts? And not one question right there is where this whole thing kicks off. The idea that the Bible might have missing pieces isn't just a what if. For some modern religious movements, it's a core belief that sets the stage for a really incredible story of loss and, well, restoration. You see, this whole idea of a fragmented Bible is a huge deal in the Book of Mormon, which is a foundational text for the Latter-day Saint faith. This particular verse talks about a vision where essential, plain, and precious parts of the original scriptures were literally removed, which you can imagine creates a theological need to get them back. All right, so let's really dig into this concept of a Bible with gaps. This isn't just some hypothetical thought experiment. For believers, it's the fundamental reason, the premise, that opens the door for new scriptures to come into the picture. Believe it or not, there's actually a fancy word for these kinds of gaps, lacunae. Now, in academic circles, it just means any missing chunk from an old manuscript. But in this theological world we're talking about, it specifically means those plain and precious truths that are believed to have vanished from the Bible over the centuries. Okay, so if we're working with this idea that the Bible has gaps, the next logical question is, well, how do you fill them? And that's exactly where these so-called restored texts enter the scene. They're seen as the bridges that are built to span those very gaps in the ancient record. And this right here is a perfect way to see the difference. On one hand, you've got the traditional King James Bible. It's largely based on what's called the Masoretic text, a super important collection of Hebrew scriptures put together by Jewish scholars way back in the Middle Ages. But on the other hand, you have things like the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible and another book called The Pearl of Great Price. These aren't just different versions. They're presented as actual restorations of lost material, designed specifically to fill in those biblical gaps we've been talking about. Now, this is a really, really important point to get. The idea here isn't to throw out the Bible and replace it. Not at all. The stated purpose, as this verse explains, is for these new texts to work with the Bible, to help prove and clarify what its original message was supposed to be. And of course, this leads us straight into a huge point of tension, a big debate. Were these texts translated, word for word from ancient documents, or did they come about through some kind of divine revelation? This pull between translation and revelation is right at the heart of this entire conversation. So if you're coming at this from a skeptical point of view, you're probably going to look for physical proof, right? A classic example is the Book of Abraham. Joseph Smith said he got it from some ancient Egyptian papyri, but when modern Egyptologists look at the surviving fragments of those papyri, they say they're just common funeral texts that don't match the book's content. And for a lot of critics, that's a major sticking point. But then there's this other way to look at it, what some people call the content strategist view. This idea suggests we shouldn't think of these works as literal dictionary-style translations. Instead, we should see them as revelatory expansions, where an ancient artifact, like a papyrus, acts more like a prompt or a catalyst for receiving new divine information. So what on earth is a revelatory expansion? Well, take the Book of Moses. It's basically seen as the lost opening chapters of Genesis, and it introduces big ideas like a pre-earth council in heaven. Or the Book of Abraham, which talks about noble and great ones, a theme that scholars today say fits right in with other ancient Near Eastern ideas. And what's so wild is that a lot of these complex motifs were pretty much unknown in small-town America back in the 1830s. So the argument is that these texts are making explicit what the traditional Bible only hints at. Okay, so we've waded through the theology and the debates, but what does this all mean for people today? What's the real-world impact for believers? Well, this quote right here kind of sums it all up. It's from another book of scripture called the Doctrine and Covenants. For believers, the whole point is to get a complete picture of truth, past, present, and future. And these restored texts are seen as absolutely essential for getting that big panoramic view. So let's break down how this actually plays out for someone studying the scriptures. First, they actively use the restored record, like looking at the Joseph Smith translation footnotes in their Bibles. Second, this helps them see a much bigger, fuller picture. The Pearl of Great Price, for example, adds a ton of context to things you read about in the Old Testament. And the end result? Step 3 is a total transformation of how they see the scriptures. The Old Testament stops being just a collection of dusty fables and becomes this vibrant, living record. And all of this leaves us with one last big question to chew on. No matter what you believe, the idea itself is incredibly powerful. Think about it. How does restoring the past, or even just the idea of filling in the gaps of history, change how we understand our lives right here, right now? It's a question that really gets to the core of why we look for answers in the first place.